My camera is malfunctioning. I don't quite know why. I hope you can see me.
A few moments later.
Hello guys, this is Samrangi Roy. Welcome back to my channel, and this is a video that's going to be a little different from the kind of videos I've already made. Many of my juniors, many of my viewers and my followers on Instagram, they have asked me to make a video on certain writing rules, certain tips, tricks and techniques that you need to remember if you want to write more effectively, especially if you're into story writing, novel writing, you want to get published in magazines and journals. So in this video I'm going to be talking about certain tips and certain mistakes that new writers make, which eventually end up with them getting rejected by the publishers and editors. It's very difficult to get published in this market. However, there are various self-publishing platforms that are available to you, but I do not exactly recommend those platforms. However, let's not get into that right now. Let's jump straight into the video without further ado. So, the 5 things that you absolutely need to remember whenever you're going to write a story, be it in your school essay, be it for any story that you're writing as a leisure activity, or even if it's a novel that you want to publish. So, the 5 elements are: number 1, plot; number 2, setting; number 3, characters; and number 4, conflict. And there's also another additional number 5, and that is the language. So, these are the 5 top most important things that you absolutely need to master, absolutely need to know about, and absolutely need to incorporate in your writing if you want to make it effective. Now I'm going to deal with all of these things in detail. Number 1, plot. The plot is something that many new writers, they do not have any idea about when they are, sitting to write down a novel. So many writers are impulsive writers. They just get into it and then they just let the story take them wherever it wants to. And then there are other writers who, they first and foremost, they frame the plot, they do the storyboarding, and then they chalk out the entire plot, what event is going to come after what, and then they set out to write a story. So there are planned writers, and then there are impulsive writers who are also known as pantsers. I happen to be a pantser, and I never had any of my plots planned. So anyway, it's not like you have to have a plot planned in order to write a successful story. You can absolutely not have a plot planned and still end up with a successful story. And even though I do not write stories as often as I used to once upon a time, but here are some of the things that I learned from my experience with publishing, from my experience with the editors, that I am going to share with you. So the plot has to be a tight one, especially if you're a new writer, especially if you're starting out new. It has to be a tight one. It can be linear or non-linear, that doesn't really matter, but the events that you're mentioning in your plot, they have to have a necessary and logical connection with the events that come before or after it. Suppose you have a plot that is full of incidents, full of events that have no relevance to the actual story whatsoever. Chances are that when you send it out for publication, the editor is going to slash out all of those parts, even if they are your favorite parts. Even if you have invested a lot of effort, a lot of energy and a lot of skill in writing those parts, if they are not relevant to your story, the editors are going to slash it out. So rather than putting so much effort and then placing it before the editor and getting all your favorite parts slashed out, do not involve anything that is not relevant to your main story. Yes, it might be relevant to your subplot, but the subplot has to be connected with the main plot in some way. It cannot be completely irrelevant. So that is number 1. Number 2, characters. So it's very, very important to have round characters in your story rather than having flat characters. So what are round characters and what are flat characters? Flat characters are characters who are consistent throughout the narrative. So if you're painting a good picture of the character, if you're introducing a character who is good, he remains good, he remains pristine, he remains super virtuous throughout the narrative from the beginning to the end. So characters like that, they become very, very predictable, and you definitely do not want to have such characters as your protagonists. Especially, you can have side characters who have minor roles, but not as your protagonist or not as one of the main characters. When you are building protagonists, when you are building important characters in your story, be it the protagonist or the antagonist, keep this in mind. You have to have round characters. You have to have characters who show some inconsistency with what they believe themselves to be, or with how you have portrayed them initially in your novel. So the characters have to be flawed. You cannot not just restrict yourself into the black and white binary, the black and white morality, that if you are painting a good character, he has to be good, virtuous throughout, and if you are painting a bad character like Lord Voldemort, he has to be bad throughout. He's just evil, pure evil. There's no reason whatsoever behind his evilness, but he is just evil and you want your readers to hate him because he is evil. No, if you're making a character do evil things, at least give them a solid reason why they are doing those things. Give them a motivation why they are doing those things. If you do not give your villains a backstory, if you do not give your protagonist a backstory, then it becomes very, very unconvincing. It becomes very, very flat. And to be honest, people do not like perfect. They get bored with perfect. So do not create perfect characters. Perfectly good or perfectly bad characters, no. Always focus on the gray, the area between the black and white. Give your characters motivations behind what they are doing. Even if you are painting a protagonist who seems to be very virtuous, make him falter from time to time. Give him small flaws, give him mistakes, make him lie, make him act inconsistent. This is how you create round characters. So this is what I had to say about characters. And another important point is that if you're writing a story, definitely do have more than 2 characters. Do not make your story only about 2 characters or only about 1 character. Please involve 2 or more characters in a story. Yes, there are some stories which revolve around 1 character, but at least include some side characters in your story. Now, there are some stories, of course, which are completely about the internal thoughts of 1 character and which focuses on the psychology of certain characters. They are different kinds of stories, but even in that you have to give your characters strong motivations behind what they do and not just, lay out what they are thinking just plainly. It has to be impactful, it has to be convincing. If you're writing a story that only has 1 character, the story has to be damn good. I cannot put it more straightforwardly. The story has to be damn good. You cannot just have 1 character and write a mediocre story. If you're having 1 character in your story, give your readers a reason to actually think that yes, you have 1 character, but you've done justice to the story in every way. So you have to make it a very impactful, thought-provoking story which has a lot of depth into it. Into setting, think of it this way: the setting is also a character in your story. So just like you would give a lot of importance to the development of your character, just like you would think a lot behind, just like you would think a lot about why a character is doing a certain thing, why a character is avoiding a certain thing, make sure you give the same amount of importance to your settings. There are various significances behind settings. For an example, if you see a very bright, happy, sunny weather full of roses, rainbows and butterflies, that obviously symbolizes something happy is going to happen. If you have a setting that is dark and gloomy with moss-covered walls, it's very natural that something spooky or eerie is coming up. So you can do a lot of world building through your settings. Settings play a very, very important role in your story. So make sure that your character's psychology, what your character is going through, and the situation that you're trying to portray, it has some kind of a link with the setting. Okay, do not create contrast between the setting and between what you're portraying. So there's this thing called psychogeography, where the weather actually is in sync with the character's moods. So that is a very, very effective plot device that you can use, psychogeography. So when you're portraying your character like he or she has hit the stumps or they are in a very despondent mood, then you can just drop in a few details about the weather that corresponds to a mood like that. So that is going to make your setting play as important a role as your character. And for an example, movies like The Witch, Call Me By Your Name, Little Women, and there are various movies, various good movies. I've seen several movies, Oscar-winning movies, Academy Award-nominated movies. All of those movies, what's special about them is that they are very atmospheric, So if you can give your writings, give your stories, your novels the same kind of quality where the atmosphere plays a very big role, where the readers can actually visualize the entire scene playing out in front of their eyes, and it's not just about the characters and what is going on in their lives, but also about the setting they are a part of, also about the weather, the city, the architecture, the politics, the culture. These are all parts of the settings that you absolutely need to remember if you want to lend credibility to your story, if you want your story to read like an event or an incident that has actually happened in reality. Moving on to conflicts. If you're writing a short story, there has to be one conflict. If you're writing bigger stories like maybe novellas or novels, try to include at least 3 to 4 conflicts, like maybe 2 conflicts in the main plot and the rest 2 in the subplot. Conflicts are very important in stories because that is what stories are made out of. If everything was well and fine and things were going on just like they ordinarily would, then what's the point of a story, right? A story is made up of conflicts. You have certain movies, certain books that have one conflict after the other, and it's like, you know, a roller coaster situation where there's an up and there's a down, climax, anticlimax, and you're thrilled from the beginning to the end. You're hooked to the novel right from the very beginning. So unless you have conflicts, it's going to be a very boring story. If you want your story to be interesting, if you want your readers to read your novel or your story at one go, then you have to incorporate as many conflicts as you possibly can. And by this I do not mean make your story all about conflicts, no, but include sufficient conflicts, at least 3 to 4 conflicts, major ones, in your story to keep your readers on their toes, hooked to your book from the beginning to the end. There can be several types of conflicts. There can be man versus man conflicts where two characters are in conflict with each other, which usually happens to be the protagonist and the antagonist. And where does the conflict arise from? The protagonist has a certain goal in mind which clashes with that of the antagonist, and that is how they are in conflict with each other, with one person trying to jeopardize the other person's plan. So this is man versus man conflict. You also have man versus nature conflicts. For an example, the movie 2012. I cannot think of a better example, man versus nature. And then there are conflicts like any sort of movies or any sort of books that deal with natural calamities and people dying as a result or people trying to survive it. They are usually man versus nature conflicts. Then the third one is man versus supernatural and Stranger Things. So whatever horror stories you see, whatever alien stories, or you know, people from Mars or other planets coming to Earth and planning to take it over. So all the superhero stories that you see, they are usually man versus supernatural conflicts. So they are also very interesting. A conflict between the man and his own internal self. So stories that are about mental illnesses, stories that are about characters coming to terms with who they are and what they think, trying to get a better hold of their emotions, trying to master their thoughts. The conflicts that usually arise as a result of a character's fluctuating emotions. Any stories about mental health, any stories about mental illnesses, struggling with mental health disorders, struggling with depression or any sort of mental health conditions, those are all those stories, they all revolve around the man versus mind conflict. So here are several conflicts, and a story can be based on all of these conflicts. Like, you do not have to force man versus supernatural in every plot. That will be ridiculous, because if you're trying to write something realistic, then obviously you cannot have that around. But at least try to involve some relevant conflicts in your story. Do not make it the same kind of conflict going on and on and on. Try to incorporate other conflicts too. Try to bring in variations. Coming up next is perhaps the most important element of story writing, and that is language. Yes, you've heard me right. And contrary to the popular opinion that your language has to be very erudite if you want your novel to read well or sell well, I would like to say that more than being erudite, I think your language should be lucid, your language should be readable, and obviously it has to be flawless. You cannot have grammatical errors in your language or a story full of grammatical errors and syntactical errors. No, that would be rejected. But if you're writing a story, you do not have to write it in, professional or erudite academic language. No, absolutely not, because most of the common people, they find a lot of difficulty reading and understanding academic and erudite language. So if you want your book to appeal to the mass, if you want the common mass to read your book and learn something from it, then you have to write it in a very lucid way. And lucid language is a lot more interesting to read than, twisted and complicated academic jargon, because you definitely do not want your readers to doze off after reading a few pages or 1 or 2 pages. If you're putting in a lot of effort in your book, it's obviously costing you your time and energy, and you want your readers to read it, right? So you have to write your book in a very lucid way. You have to write it in a way that even a lay person can learn something from it. I think that is what should be the goal of any book. That is what should be the purpose of any work of literature. It should enlighten and entertain. It has to enlighten, otherwise what is its use really? So anyway, do not use bombastic words that people have never heard of. This is a mistake that most young writers make. Even I have made this mistake with my first novel. I used a bunch of words that nobody ever heard of, and even I wasn't sure that those were the words which I found on Wordables and other sites. They had, Latin and Greek and Swedish roots, and I was not aware of that at all. I thought they were English words because they were written in English using English alphabets, and I used them, and my book ended up reading hilarious because no one could understand what those words were, and more than that, I had not used those words the way they were supposed to be used. I had used it anywhere in a sentence without really knowing how to use those particular words in sentences, so I just randomly used those words and people couldn't understand what they were. You definitely do not want your readers to be consulting a dictionary 10,000 times while reading a single book, right? 5 times while reading each page in order to make sense of what is written. So do not use bombastic words. Use normal language. Use the common language that people use. The more lucid your writing is, the more gripping and understandable it is. So use very common language. Use the language that you're speaking in, and especially if you're writing dialogues, please do not make them very, very superficial. Write dialogues exactly the way that you would speak them. If you're speaking to a friend, remember how you're speaking to that person and try to replicate those dialogues in your writing. Do not just, make up dialogues that are full of mouth sounds like and all of these things. You do not usually talk like this, please. So I've read a lot of new writers who fill up their dialogues with mouth sounds. I don't think any human ever produces sounds like those. So do not use such sounds in your writing because it doesn't look real, and no human being can produce sounds like that unless it's a rehearsed performance of some sort. Your dialogue should be as effortless to read as the rest of your book. So write realistic dialogues. Listen to conversations. When two people are having conversations, or when one person is having a conversation with a bigger group, listen to the way they are speaking. Be a good listener and then replicate those dialogues. Try to write dialogues exactly the way they are spoken. There's another mistake that many young writers make, and that is using a lot of capital letters, using a lot of punctuations like ellipses. The dots just never end, and then there are 5 to 6 exclamation marks after having expressed something very exclamatory, and then there are several question marks when a person is supposedly asking about something unbelievable that has happened. Please cut that out. This is not how books are written. If you read books, if you're in the habit of reading books, you'll know that even if something very shocking has just been pronounced, then you'll just have 1 exclamation, not 10. And even if you're asking an unbelievable question, you do not have 12 question marks after that. You usually have 1. Yes, capital letters you can use, but capital letters are mostly used when you're shouting at the other person. When 2 persons are having a conversation or an argument of some sort, and one person actually ends up shouting at the other person and they're having a full-blown quarrel or fight, that's when you use capital letters. But even when you're using capital letters there to portray a fight or a misunderstanding, limit the use of capital letters. Do not just use them generously and have 1 page full of capital letters. No. Lastly, if you're really interested in writing, try to avoid stereotypes. Try to avoid the already established tropes that you see in many movies, in many books, especially if it's love stories. People use so many cliches there, and recurring patterns, recurring themes, recurring dialogues, and recurring concepts. It becomes very, very monotonous. So if you're writing something like that, try to come up with something new. Try to break the stereotypes or subvert the tropes that you've already come across many times. Do not just fall into the same patterns. Do not just jump on the bandwagon and keep repeating what has already been done many, many times. So try to come up with something different, try to subvert what already exists, try to think of it in a different way, in a different vein, if you want your novel to be effective, if you want your novel to be read by many, many people and appreciated, of course. Remember, once it's out there, once you've already published it, be it through a traditional publisher or a self-publisher or a hybrid publisher, whatever it is, once it's out there, you cannot take it back, no matter how hard you try. So when you're putting your work out there, make sure you're fully satisfied with your work and only then put it out there. Now, it's very difficult for writers to be satisfied with what they are writing. So the best thing would be to ask for feedback, to ask your seniors, to ask your friends, your relatives, whoever is interested to read your work for feedback. And feedback doesn't necessarily mean they'll just flatter you insincerely just to make you happy. No, that is not the kind of feedback feedback you should be looking forward to. Pay attention to the criticisms, pay attention to what they are asking you to change, and consider them. Consider what needs to be changed and take the criticisms in a good way. Do not just become defensive and try to justify why you've done something the way you've done it. Try to be open to criticisms, try to take constructive criticisms in your stride, and spend some time with your book, So it often happens that when you've written a novel and you're fully in the thick of the action and you're reading it over and over again, after a point it seems like whatever you've written is shit and it's very bad and you do not want to even read it and you do not think that other people are going to read it and appreciate it. This happens to every writer. If you're with your book for a very long period of time and reading it every day and making changes and corrections, reading it over and over again, it seems very monotonous, it seems very tiring. So the best thing to do in that situation would be spend a few months away from your book. Just don't look at it anymore. You finished writing, you finished all the corrections, you finished editing your book. Now just keep it away from you for 2-3 months. And then after 2-3 months, go back and read it again. I'm sure you're going to find many changes that are required. I'm sure you're going to spot many mistakes when you're seeing it with fresh eyes. And the thing that you were feeling about your book back then, that maybe it's trash, maybe it will never be appreciated, after 3 months, I'm guaranteeing you, you will love your work and you will feel confident publishing it. But you will also notice many mistakes, many errors which need to be changed. I hope you have the strength, you have the energy to change them and also the willingness to change them. Because as long as you find mistakes in your book, it's well and fine, you have to make changes. But once it's out there, and after that, if you find any errors, any glaring mistakes, then you cannot change it. It's already out there, you cannot take it back. So as long as the book is with you, make full use of that time to make all the necessary corrections, to send your writing out for feedback, get constructive criticism, work on them, and when you're publishing it, when it's fully ready to be out there in the market, to be read by your readers, make sure it's perfect, make sure you're fully satisfied with the content that you've produced. So these were my tips and tricks and techniques that you all wanted me to cover in one of my videos. I have a lot more to say about this. If you found this video helpful, definitely comment below, and if you want more such videos on writing, comment that down too. It will help me realize what exactly you want to watch. If you liked this video, then definitely hit the like button, share it with your friends, subscribe to my channel, and do not forget to hit the bell icon to get regular updates whenever I upload any video. Hope you're safe, hope you're happy, hope you're keeping well. See you again in my next video. Till then, bye-bye.